Welcome to episode number 2 in the series 10 Arguments Against Ethical Objectivity. In this episode, we're going to talk about the idea that all truth is subjective. Now, how does this cast doubt on moral objectivity? You're going to learn that, and you're also going to learn how we can respond to this argument or cast doubt on it so that moral objectivity still comes out looking okay. Welcome to the Philosophical Life. Now, a common thought among a lot of people is that all truth is subjective. And this doesn't just apply to morality, this actually applies to biology, physics, chemistry, basically anything. All truth is just relative to an individual perspective, so there isn't anything like truth out there in the world to be discovered and found. This results in casting doubt on morality. How does it do that? Well, let's look at the argument. Now, the argument against objective truths is really simple. It just has one premise and a conclusion. The first premise is that there are no objective truths, and the last premise. And then the conclusion is, therefore, there are no objective moral truths. Now let's examine the premise. Is it the case that there are no objective truths? Well, the first thing to notice is that this is an interesting strategy move. Why? Well, a common way of arguing against ethical objectivism is to compare morality as a discipline to other disciplines, such as some of the hard scientists, and show that morality in some way falls short of standards for truth that other disciplines do not fall short of. Now, by embracing premise 1, the opponent of moral objectivity is casting aside that strategy. Now let's take a look at premise 1 to see whether it's any good or not. Well, premise 1 is either true or false. If premise 1 is false, then the argument can't be sound. You may recall, soundness requires a good structure, requires validity, and it requires the premise to be true. That's how we guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Now, this argument is valid, that is, when you assume the premise is true, that there are no objective truths, then it follows that there are no objective moral truths. After all, moral truths are a category of truths. Now let's assume that premise 1 is true. Well, if premise 1 is true, then there's at least one objective truth, namely premise 1. And if there's one objective truth, then it's false that there are no objective truths. There's at least one objective truth, namely premise 1. As such, if we assume the premise is true, then the premise becomes false, so it can't be true. And then if the premise is false, as we said originally, then the argument falls apart, it's not sound. So either way, this argument is riddled with problems. Now, since premise 1 is, if it's true, then it's false, as we said, then it follows that there are some objective truths. Now, you might still doubt whether the moral truths fall into that category or whether all moral truths are subjective, but at least arguing against the objectivity of moral truths is not going to be captured by this argument, so we have to look elsewhere. Thanks for joining me on this episode of The Philosophical Life. Keep thinking ethically and living wisely. Keep living the philosophical life.